The wind screamed through the pine-covered hills of Llano County on the night of July 3, 1997, carrying with it a chill that didn't belong to the Texas summer. Inside a rustic family lodge nestled near the banks of the Colorado River, 5 cousins were laughing, sharing ghost stories under a flickering lantern, the walls echoing with innocence and trust. By dawn, they were gone. No broken locks, no shattered glass, no footprints in the dew-covered grass, just a table set for breakfast they never ate, and shoes lined up neatly at the door. It was as if the earth had swallowed them whole, leaving behind nothing but silence and a smell of burnt cedar no one could explain. For decades, the case became a dark legend whispered around campfires, a bloodstain on the town's soul too faded to scrub away. But in March 2024, something was found buried beneath a collapsed root cellar 4 miles from the lodge. What the FBI unearthed reignited a nightmare long thought buried. It began with a rusted hinge, groaning open to reveal a dank, forgotten space beneath what was once a hunting cabin, long consumed by drought-snapped trees and creeping ivy. The root cellar had collapsed decades earlier, sealed away by layers of time and a community's need to forget. But on a clear spring afternoon, a development crew clearing brush for a wildlife preserve stumbled upon something strange: brickwork, too precise, too intentional, jutting from the earth like the remnants of a sodden tomb. Within hours, the FBI's evidence response team descended on the site, their faces grim as they peeled back layers of soil and history. And then, wrapped in dust-stained tarpaulins and packed beneath straw and charred timbers, they found it. A withered canvas duffel bag filled with 5 children's journals, still titled in crayon, still smelling faintly of cedar smoke, pages soaked with rain and time, but legible enough to ruin you. One journal ended with a single word, scrawled violently across the last page in crimson ink. He. July 1st, 1997. The cousins had arrived just before dusk, their parents laughing over car trunks stuffed with coolers, fishing rods, and an optimism that only came from long Texas drives onto open land. The ranch-style lodge had been in the family for generations, built by their great-grandfather after returning from the war, his hands shaping every beam and floorboard, like he was carving safety into the bones of the place. The kids Emma, Tyler, Jonah, Mirabel, and Lucas were aged between 7 and 13. They loved the lodge in different ways. Mirabel, the poet, always spoke of the wind through the rafters as if the house breathed. Tyler, the oldest, played protector, carrying a flashlight like a sword ready to pierce the dark. That summer, the lodge was supposed to be a temporary escape from grief. Tragedy had just touched the family that spring. The cousin's aunt, Amelia Ramirez, had died under unclear circumstances, a fall from a bluff west of Austin. Her death fractured the family in quiet ways. The lodge, they'd hoped, would heal them. Instead, it became a graveyard with no headstones. That first night, the air felt heavy, as if the walls remembered something the family did not. Around midnight, Jonah woke screaming. No one could calm him. He pointed toward the ceiling, shrieking about something with eyes in the beams. Lucas, half asleep and confused, muttered about scratching sounds he'd heard earlier, like claws on wood. Emma claimed she saw Aunt Amelia at the edge of the forest that night, wearing the same maroon velvet coat she was buried in. Their grandmother dismissed it all as the wild imaginings of children rattled by grief. But in the morning, Tyler's flashlight was found outside, still glowing weakly in the damp grass, pointed straight at the tree line. Deep furrows in the earth led from the porch toward the woods, tracks too irregular to be animal, too chaotic to be human. Mirabel wrote in her journal that day, in looping, uncertain handwriting. "The woods called to us last night. They sounded like her voice, but it wasn't hers. It wasn't." 3 days passed in a strange fog of denial and fractured memories. The adults remained tethered to their routines, grilling fish from the river, drinking coffee until late, whispering cautiously behind closed doors. But the children grew quieter, their laughter dwindling to silence, as something unseen crept ever closer. Emma stopped eating. Lucas refused to sleep, without every light in the room turned on. Mirabel began making crude dolls from corn husks and tying them with red string, burying them beneath the flower beds like offerings. Then, on the night of July 3rd, their last night, Tyler dragged Jonah from bed in a panic, claiming he'd seen the same velvet coat floating outside their window, unmoving, watching. He searched for answers in their great-grandfather's old ledger beneath the fireplace tiles. A loose page, marked with a symbol none of them recognized, an inverted crown over 3 dots. That night, just before the hush fell over the hills, Emma picked up her journal and wrote a single sentence before vanishing forever. She said, "We're already inside." For nearly 3 decades, the investigation stood still, frozen like the last breath of a child lost in the dark. Local law enforcement, overwhelmed and under-equipped, followed every tip that trickled in from psychics, late-night callers, and drifters who claimed to have seen 5 spectral figures walking the riverbanks. The lodge was searched again and again, every floorboard lifted, every crawlspace mapped. But the deeper they dug, the more questions they uncovered. The symbol Tyler found, the inverted crown over 3 dots, began appearing elsewhere, carved lightly into a tree stump near the old well, scrawled behind a cupboard door in the kitchen, burned faintly into the underside of an iron skillet, hung on the wall places no child would ever have ventured alone. The FBI quietly reopened the case in 2012, citing new forensic advancements and inconsistencies in the original timeline. The journals, recovered in 2024, were what changed everything, because they suggested something unimaginable, that the children had never truly left the lodge at all. Deep beneath the final pages of Emma's journal, hidden between 2 stuck-together sheets, forensic analysts discovered something even more chilling. An older letter, water-damaged and ink-blurred, addressed to L.R. and dated June 28, 1952. It was a plea written in trembling script, warning of a presence beneath the lodge, something ancient, awakened by war trauma, and sealed by blood oath rituals no one wanted to explain. The handwriting matched that of their great-grandfather. It spoke of her, a whispering thing cloaked in the shape of the dead, and of a mistake made during a solstice ritual long before the children were born. The letter described how they had built the lodge atop a fissure with roots that drink memory, and warned that if children laughed too loudly in its halls, the thing below would remember what it had lost. That letter, hidden for 72 years, was authenticated by the FBI's document team. It was not a story. It wasn't a fable. It was a confession, and it wasn't written to warn. It was written to apologize. A week after the letter's discovery, the FBI deployed ground-penetrating radar beneath the foundation of the lodge. What they found was not a passage, but what one agent called a subsurface anomaly, a honeycomb of hollowed corridors that extended far beyond the dimensions of the house. Structural engineers traced the chambers and concluded they predated the lodge by decades, even centuries, but no known settlement had existed in the region at the time. When a drone camera was lowered through a breach in the earth, it revealed cryptic markings on the walls, etched into limestone like a language made of wounds. One frame caught something else. 5 impressions in the dust, child-sized, side by side, as if waiting for something. Nothing moved in the footage, but somewhere between frames, a flicker of light appeared, red, pulsing, unblinking before vanishing again. And behind the drone's final moment of signal loss, a low, reverberating sound could be heard. Not wind, not water, a voice, laughing. The footage was immediately sealed, archived under federal protective orders, and never released to the public. But by then, the roots of the story had already wrapped their tendrils around everything it touched. Former agents came forward anonymously, speaking of sleepless nights and strange dreams, of being followed by laughter that never echoed. One technician assigned to audio analysis reportedly requested a leave of absence after claiming he heard his childhood nickname, long forgotten, whispered between the static pulses. The anomaly beneath the lodge was classified as a prohibited excavation zone, fenced off and monitored. Yet, that summer, reports surfaced of children in neighboring counties who suddenly began drawing the same inverted crown in school notebooks, dreaming of red lights beyond old cellar doors. Mirabel's last journal entry offered no resolution, only a riddle. If we are inside, then what's still knocking? The air hangs heavy around Llano County now. The lodge remains, hollow and boarded, but locals say the wind there returns your name to you, in someone else's voice. In the years that followed, a quiet grief settled over the faded photographs and dust-covered toys the family refused to pack away. Every July, relatives returned to the lodge grounds, not to hope, but to remember. They stopped grilling. They stopped fishing. They just stood together in silence, watching the river carry away another year. But in April 2024, a single photograph surfaced, an undeveloped roll of film recovered from the duffel bag's inner lining. It had somehow survived the rot and ash. The negative was processed, revealing a grainy image taken on the lodge porch, 5 silhouettes beneath the twilight sky, and a 6th figure behind them, partially hidden in shadow. Too tall to be a child. Unblurred, despite the movement. Wearing a maroon velvet coat, experts ruled out double exposure or editing. This was a raw image, taken by a child's trembling hand. And there she was. Aunt Amelia. Or something that wore her face. The discovery of that photograph shattered what little denial the family still clung to. They had buried Amelia with trembling hands and salt-stung prayers, convinced her death had been an accident, a terrible misstep on a windswept cliff. But the figure in the frame was not a memory. It was something else entirely, something watching. Always watching. When forensic artists enhanced the image to analyze depth and shadow, they uncovered something no one was prepared for. The 6th figure did not cast a shadow. Beneath her feet, light bled wrong, bent unnaturally, as if the porch itself refused to touch her. Just days later, one of the surviving uncles, Luis Ramirez, was found in his home, surrounded by burned corn husks and murmuring to himself in broken Spanish, repeating the same 2 words, "Ella vino." She came. His fingernails were packed with earth and cedar wax, his eyes swollen shut from weeping. Authorities found a page torn from one of the journals clenched in his fist. On it, in red crayon, a child had drawn 5 stars trapped inside a house with no door. And above it all, that same twisted crown, etched again and again as if trying to remember or to forget. In late May of 2024, a specialist in child psychology was brought into the investigation, not for counseling but for translation. After reviewing Mirabel's journal, specifically the cornhusk dolls and their red bindings, she noted eerie similarities to a folk tradition originating from northern Spain, where binding dolls represented a form of containment, not comfort. In certain Basque villages, stories once spoke of la interlocutora. The interlocutor, a spectral woman in velvet, who would come to take the words of children too sorrowful to speak aloud, offering them sanctuary that looked like home but was rooted in something far older. The researcher noted linguistic overlaps in Mirabel's writings, words and phrases. No child in Central Texas would naturally use phrases like, "She waits between sleep and soil," and "We are spoken for." More chilling, when shown the photograph, she quietly closed the file and whispered. She was summoned, not stumbled upon. That same night, lightning struck the old lodge, igniting a fire that charred the roof but didn't spread. The firefighters found nothing but soot and stone, but one reported seeing fresh footprints in the ash, small and clustered together, walking away from where the back wall used to be. No one could explain how 5 sets of footprints left no point of entry. The pattern could no longer be denied. From Llano County to the echoing hills of San Saba and the hidden settlements near Fredonia, reports began to thread together a haunting cartography. Children, waking in the night, to sketch the same symbols in chalk, to speak of voices that mimicked their mothers, but lacked breath. School counselors described sudden losses of speech, followed by drawings of doors deep underground and rivers that ran red beneath the soil. The FBI, facing mounting pressure and fragments of something bigger than folklore, invited an interdisciplinary team of historians, linguists, theologians, and folklorists to examine the phenomenon. Each came with their methods, but none could agree except on this. The symbol, The crown with 3 dots matched no known religious, cultural, or esoteric image. It was alien, yet somehow intimate, like the shape of a dream that arrives before sleep. One expert hesitantly described it, not as a warning or a seal, but a signature. A name written with silence. And perhaps most terrible of all, they realized, the journals weren't just records of experience. They were invitations. Each entry, like flares sent out from within a place the children were pulled to, or willingly walked into, a place that still called. A place that might still answer. There is a photograph now sealed in a federal archive, labeled Exhibit F-17. It shows the burned ruins of the lodge after the 2024 fire, long streaks of ash curling like claws around the broken stone hearth. But what draws every eye is not the collapsed roof or the scorched furniture. It is what sits at the very center, unburned and untouched. A doll, corn husk twisted carefully, wrapped in red thread, standing upright in a circle of clean stone, as if placed there moments before the flames descended. Infrared scans of the footage revealed no heat signature from the doll, no human trace nearby, yet one of the fire marshals swore it hadn't been there when he entered. Another photograph, taken seconds before, shows nothing, just ruin. Smoke. Silence. And then her. At the edge of the smoke, barely visible through a curl of rising ash, the same velvet coat, the same unblinking eyes, and beside her, outlined faintly in the soot, 5 smaller shadows, holding hands. The case was no longer a cold file. It had become a burning wound on the edge of reality, daring anyone to name what had taken root beneath the soil. In early June, whispers emerged from within the FBI task force, rumors that one of the journals had contained a coded map of dates and lunar cycles, aligning with ancient solstice rituals that spanned continents and centuries. The entries referenced open nights, when time became porous and thresholds thin, cross-referencing astrological data. The team isolated dates back through the past 4 decades, when similar disappearances, albeit smaller and overlooked, had occurred within a 50-mile radius. A hitchhiker vanished in 1983, twin sisters during a camping trip in 1976. A teenage boy who left home after claiming voices spoke from the floor of his room. None of these missing persons cases had been connected until now, a pattern woven with the precision of grief. As solstice approached once again, the team grew divided. Some demanded the site be sealed permanently, buried deeper beneath concrete and secrecy. Others argued it must be opened fully, studied from within, even entered. Yet what lingered longest was Emma's final message, traced now with ultraviolet ink in symbols layered deeper than crayon. It had been missed. A second line, slight but legible. Beneath, "She said we're already inside," were the words. But only one of us remembers how to get out. In late June, a final attempt was made to decode the journals using a new spectral layering algorithm developed for archaeological texts. The process revealed faded inscriptions, indented between lines of childish handwriting, that matched a cipher used by a now-defunct Cold War-era listening post, once based just north of Fredericksburg. Decryption efforts stunned the team. Beneath Mirabelle's sentences about dolls and dreams were strings of coordinates and phrases in archaic Latin, as if filtered through broken memory. One phrase repeated across all 5 journals, always hidden between benign entries. Vera in domo manet. The truth remains in the house. But what hit harder than any revelation wasn't the coded Latin. It was the page found folded inside Lucas's journal, pressed so tightly it had once been mistaken for glue molding. It was a drawing, a floor plan of the lodge and its surroundings. Only here, the lodge had no foundation. It floated above pitch-black ink, where a spiraling staircase descended into nothing. At the very bottom, in childlike scrawl, one final message had been written, flanked by the familiar crimson ink. "We're not lost. You're just not listening." And beneath it, the inverted crown no longer drawn with hesitation, but perfectly symmetrical. By mid-July 2024, the lodge and its surrounding lands were declared a federal anomalous site, restricted under laws typically reserved for classified defense installations. Surveillance drones circled the perimeter. Motion-triggered cameras blinked red in the dark. And yet, something continued slipping through. Wildlife monitors recorded herds of deer halting abruptly near the outer fence, refusing to cross. Dogs in the area barked at nothing, or sometimes whined in the direction of the burnt remains. Then came the children, all under the age of 12, each reported missing for only minutes before being found barefoot near the site, dazed and silent, with a strange residue clinging to their skin. One boy, age 9, began compulsively drawing the lodge floor plan from memory, though he'd never been there. He muttered to himself constantly, in rhymes and fragments. The last thing he said before falling into an unexplainable sleep: "She walks with 5, but only 4 remember being born." When investigators returned to Exhibit F-17 for review, they found the doll had shifted. Its head was now tilted. It faced the lodge's ruins. And the red thread, which had once bound its limbs, was unspooled and vanished. The Ramirez family, now marked by decades of unanswered prayers and silence weighted heavier than grief, gathered once again on the anniversary of that vanished summer. They stood among the blackened stone and ash, their faces turned toward the gutted hills, time-weathered hands clinging to memories that refused to remain still. This time, they brought nothing, no flowers, no letters, just the quiet of those who have knelt too long at an altar that gives no return. But when dusk settled and the sky bruised violet, a soft rustling stirred the air, though no wind had blown, and then came the laughter. Faint, fractured, like echoes long trapped under floorboards, escaping at last. Luis heard it first, then Mirabel's older sister, who had never spoken a word of that night. One by one, every adult there turned not toward the lodge, but toward the river. There, caught in the glint of dying light, 5 footprints shimmered briefly on the water's edge before being carried downstream. Not washed away. Carried, as if someone or something had come to walk them home. That autumn, several members of the investigative team resigned in quick succession, citing conflicting reasons: stress, health, personal loss. One agent refused to speak but left behind a notebook filled with pages of mirrored text and spiraling patterns in phosphorescent ink, all concluding with a question: how do you mourn what remains? Local officials attempted to cordon off the land permanently, burying it beneath bureaucratic layers and steel fencing, but erosion soon revealed again what Earth did not want: hidden a vent in the hillside, thin and breathing, releasing a faint, sweet scent of cedar smoke that lingered across the valley like a lullaby refusing to fade. And once more, children began singing nursery rhymes that no one taught them. One final photograph surfaced online for only 9 minutes before it was removed, a grainy, color-distorted image taken from a moving vehicle near the lodge site. It shows a figure in maroon, standing at the tree line beneath the moon, facing away. Beside her, 5 shadows, small and still staring directly into the camera, their eyes a blur of red. No one has claimed the photo, but those who saw it say they dream the same thing now: the crackling of fire, a porch without shadows, and the hum of a voice that sounds like velvet, asking, softly. Now, nothing grows near the remnants of the lodge. Not even weeds. The earth has hardened there, sunken like a scar that won't close, and no bird dares nest in the trees above it. Occasionally, wanderers wander too close, drawn by whispers of the unsolved, or perhaps something deeper, older, more ancestral. But those who do rarely speak of it afterward. Their photos come back overexposed, their audio riddled with soft humming, and always, they describe the feeling the same way: not fear, but recognition, as if some forgotten part of themselves had been called home. Scientists, historians, even clergy have since tried to define what happened on that cursed patch of Texas soil, but none have succeeded. Some say the cousins were taken. Others claim they vanished into their own imaginations, consumed by mourning, and a story too vividly told. And yet, In the highest vault of the FBI's restricted archive, there sits a final evidence folder labeled with the children's initials. It remains sealed. The tape is gray, the label handwritten, and beneath the names, just one line. They are not gone. Only hiding where we cannot yet look. On the eve of August 1st, under a cobalt sky scabbed with stars, the lodge site trembled, not with movement, but with return. In a secure observation post overlooking the valley, a camera trained on the soil recorded a change so small it almost went unnoticed until the frame skipped. In one instant, silence. In the next, the doll returned. Placed again in the same circle of stone, its head now tilted upward. Its red thread wound tightly into a spiral no one had ever seen before. Below its feet, someone had etched a new symbol into the ash. A door. 3 steps. An open mouth. Experts called in for analysis found their instruments failed to function as though whatever the doll had become repelled measurement itself. Then, shortly after, a final message was uncovered beneath the original ledger tiles, hidden in a lead casing preserved by time and oversight. A single strip of parchment, no ink, only impression. When dusted with activated carbon, the etched phrase finally revealed itself, pressing through from some other moment. They wait for us to say their names. Then they will know which ones to bring back. Somewhere, far from the scorched edges of Llano County, in a dusty box tucked within the Smithsonian's off-limits holdings, an old crayon drawing lay forgotten on acid-free paper, a copy of one of Emma's entries, made before the original was sealed. A curator stumbled upon it during reorganization, mistaking it for a harmless child's sketch. But beneath the sun-colored sky and stick-figure faces, she saw the unmistakable shape of the lodge, not as it stood in 1997, but as it once might have been centuries before, surrounded by stone monoliths and symbols carved into the air itself. And there, in one corner, drawn apart from the others, a figure sat by the river, her maroon coat trailing into the current, her hand extended upward, not beckoning, but offering. Behind her, the crown hovered, its 3 dots glowing amber in a place no light should reach. The curator stared, the air suddenly colder, heavier, and from the drawing, where no sound should ever emerge, came the faintest echo like breath over a child's ear. "Listening now?" it whispered. And then, silence, the kind that waits. In the depth of winter 2025, with the investigation quietly transitioning from whispered legend to classified anomaly, a final directive was issued by the Department of Internal Anomalies, a rarely cited statute authorizing a field access clearance for one last inspection of the site, not to find the missing, not to close the case, but to observe. A forensic linguist, a folklorist, and a child psychologist were escorted to the fissured remains of the Ramirez Lodge, cameras activated, instruments primed. They stayed for just 90 minutes. When they returned, they said not a word, but the lead agent wrote a note that would later be discovered, tucked inside his pass card. In shaky script it read, "I saw them. Not aged. Not afraid. Just watching, as if we were the ones who had gone missing." His badge was laid on red thread in the center of the doll circle, and the next morning, it too was gone. Only the ash remained curling upward, drawn back into the trembling mouth of the earth, like a story that had not ended, only begun again. Somewhere, in silence. In private forums, where whistleblowers gather under handles and hashes, recordings have begun to circulate videos taken from within the observation perimeter, where audio picks up not static, but humming, rhythmic, and strangely melodic. One shows leaves on the ground shifting in unison, as if breathing. Another, more chilling, captures a shadow crossing the camera's line of sight without a source, followed by a brief glimpse of small fingers pressing against the glass on the inside. Experts are confounded. Some argue it's mass psychogenic illness entangled with unresolved trauma. Others suspect the byproduct of a classified experiment gone wrong. buried under myth to contain fallout. But those who've touched the place, truly felt it, speak in no such riddles. They say the 5 cousins never truly vanished, that they are still there, beneath the stone and ash, pacing the space between heartbeat and memory. Listening. Waiting. And every year, as summer drips into fall, the velvet shadow returns not to haunt, but to gather. Because home isn't always where we return. Sometimes, it's where something waits for us to forget who we were, so it can remember who to become. In early September 2025, amid a heat wave that cracked the canyon's skin and baked silence into the trees, the FBI officially closed the Ramirez Lodge case to the public, reclassifying it under a new title, Event Echo 6. But closure, like truth, is a matter of belief. And in a modest farmhouse, an hour west of the site, Mirabelle's sister still keeps the cousins' old journals locked in a cedar chest, their pages decaying slowly beneath wax paper and bundles of sage. Some nights, she swears the covers flutter without wind, that the handwriting shifts slightly, changing shape to match voices long faded. One journal Jonah's never stopped bleeding ink. It soaks a new word into the paper every season. Last winter, it wrote soon. This summer, home. And tonight, after the last cicada fell silent in the burning dusk, a final message spread like a bruise beneath the surface. Not written, but pressed. Like breath against the edge of forgetting, it read, "We remember how to leave, but only if someone asks us to stay." In the end, no reports were filed, no media briefings held. The lodge became not a mystery to solve, but a boundary to respect. Like an unspoken line between waking and dream, presence and memory. Visitors are rare now, and those who come do not linger. The local children walk wide circles around the land, whispering cautionary rhymes that don't exist in any book. And somewhere beneath it all, beneath stone and ash and a grief no language can contain, 5 voices linger laced with laughter, shadow, longing. The world above keeps spinning, pretending to forget. But somewhere, beneath the roots and between the pages, a story continues to breathe. Not finished. Not erased. Just waiting. And when the wind returns its cry through those pine-covered hills, it no longer sounds like wind at all. It sounds like names, softly spoken, as if someone is calling them home, one by one. Through the gaps in the veil, it's still listening, still waiting, still there. But even now, as the soil reclaims what little remains and the wind learns silence anew, whispers continue to find their way into unlikely hollows. A ranger hiking near Llano's western ridge reported hearing a girl's voice reciting something softly, 7 syllables, repeated like a pulse. Leave the door inside alone. Cellular service failed for precisely that minute. His body camera glitched, restored, and the footage showed only his own shadow split by 5 others, all smaller, standing still behind him though no one was there. He filed no report, just left his badge at the county office and never returned. And in towns miles away, on dusty roads close to no remembered origin, children have begun to hum lullabies. No adult taught them. Their melodies encoded with sorrow, with place, with waiting. The lodge may be ash, the documents may be sealed, but memory, that living, echoing wound, remains carved into the earth itself, and into those who dare listen long enough to hear the names rustling beneath root and stone. The missing were never lost, only dreaming louder than the world would allow. And now, piece by piece, their dreams are waking. Elsewhere, in the ruins of a long-forgotten Spanish mission buried under shale-rich hills southwest of Junction, archaeologists made a curious discovery. It was an etching, just 2 inches wide, carved into the underside of a stone worship slab, hidden until the slab was overturned for preservation. The image, a crown with 3 dots, perfectly aligned. The carbon dating placed the stone's use in the late 1600s. Nearby, fragments of children's pottery were unearthed, painted with spiral staircases and velvet-robed figures in ochre and coal. Historians paused, then rechecked maps. No known mission existed on that land. No town, no trail. Just a dry riverbed and the haunting resonance of children's laughter, once again captured faintly in a dig site recording. The lead archaeologist, a woman with a quiet skepticism forged from decades of dust and disappointment, reviewed the images that night in her tent. Later, her colleagues found her notes abandoned near a burning sage bundle. She left only one line on her final page. She was never summoned. She was remembered. And so the lodge remains neither ruin nor relic, but a wound suspended in the shape of home. Its story slips easily from lip to lip now, not as legend, but as inheritance. Locals have long stopped trying to map its edges or name its shadow. They simply mark the time with silence, when the red leaves fall early, or the birds pause mid-flight near Llano. Somewhere high above the fields, the wind catches the scent of cedar and ash and braids them into lullabies carried downstream. And far below, in the quiet marrow of the Texas earth, 5 names pulse, like a heartbeat too distant to forget. Not etched on graves or carved in stone, but kept alive in the spaces between telling and listening. Because memory, when tended long enough, does not decay. It transforms. It calls back. And now, even in the stillness, even with the fire gone cold and the journals sealed, something stirs a hush, a hum, a closing breath. Not an ending, a return. To this day, when the sun sinks beneath the bone-dry horizon of Llano County and the shadows stretch like old stories, locals swear they can feel it, the weight of the lodge's silence, pulling like a tide under their skin. The children who once wandered too close speak of missing time, of dreams that feel realer than memory. And among the crows roosting in the pines, watchers swear they see something move between the trees, cloaked in velvet the color of dried blood. The official word speaks of fire damage, folklore, closure, but those who've stood near that soil know different. They speak of footprints that appear where no one walks, of dolls blooming like weeds from ash, of names whispered not in warning but invitation. The Ramirez cousins are not gone, not truly. They have become the breath of something older, an echo straining for form. And one day, when the veil thins again, when someone dares to ask the right name at the right time, they may come back, not to be found, but to remember us into silence. Inside the Smithsonian's deepest archival vaults, where light bends strange and time feels thick, another file waits to be catalogued, to be forgotten, or perhaps to be opened by accident. It bears no markings, no code, just a child's scrawl on worn cardboard, for when lost makes sense again. Within it, pieces of things once known, a velvet scrap pressed between biblical pages, 5 carved wooden buttons, and a strip of film undeveloped but curiously warm to the touch. A note, taped to the lid, written in ink that fades when read directly, reappears when reflected in glass. It bears the names of the cousins, but not their birth names. Instead, new ones, echoing things. Watcher, whisper, shelter, path, and bind. Below them, another symbol not seen before. An open eye. A doorway. A single, downward-pointing star. And beside it, a warning or an invitation. 7 words scratched into aged veneer, trembling yet clear. Only silence knows which dreams are real. This, historians may never explain, but somewhere a door waits. Not open, not closed, just listening. And so the story settles, not into an ending, but into the seams between myth and memory, a place where names are spoken only by the land itself, where laughter echoing through pine and ash is not lost, but lodged, waiting. The Ramirez cousins became tethered not to time but to the deep hum of place, to a silence that does not forget. Llano County sleeps on, unaware and uneasy, while beneath its feet, between breath and shadow, something continues tracing spirals in the dark. Not evil, not merciful, just present. And as each solstice comes, as each stranger nears the ruins unknowing, the veil trembles again, thin, as a whispered name. In some ways, the cousins were never meant to return, Perhaps they became something greater. Perhaps they remained exactly who they were. 5 children, holding hands, calling home to those who haven't yet remembered how to listen. And somewhere, inside a sky the color of old velvet, a door stands slightly ajar, waiting for its story to be found again. And maybe that is where all true stories must live, not in answers, but in echoes, in the chill that whispers just before dawn, in the flicker on a screen not yet explained, in the journal entries no one meant to write. The Ramirez cousins may never be found as names on their birth certificates, as children who vanished from the living world. But in the folds of these legends, they have become something more memory incarnate, wrapped in velvet shadows and the scent of cedar, a message scrawled through time not with ink but with longing. The lodge is silent now, yes, but that silence listens. And when the wind rises just right, curling like breath across Llano's jagged hills, it carries with it not fear, but remembrance of 5 children, and the story they left behind, not for closure, but for belief. And perhaps, when the veil thins one notch further, when night forgets to end, we'll hear them once more. Not lost, not gone, just calling home, by name. Somewhere, in the archival dark, no one enters without purpose. There remains a single remaining reel of 8mm film unlabeled, warped by time, and long dismissed as deterioration footage. But when a technician accidentally fed it through a restored projector in late autumn of 2025, the room fell quiet. The film, though degraded, played clearly. Grainy footage of a girl standing at the lodge's front door, Mirabelle. She turns toward the camera, eyes wide, not frightened, but serene. Behind her, 4 other children wait in the shadowed hall. They are not restless, not trapped. They are waiting. Mirabelle mouths something, and though the footage bears no audio, one lip reader confirmed the phrase, "We are not the ending." Then the film burns, splitting down the center, curling at the edges, but frames of it linger still, burned into the screen like a fingerprint. A family, preserved not as tragedy or myth, but as proof. Some stories leave traces too steady to erase, and even in silence, they speak. To be remembered, not resolved. No official has spoken publicly since the film reel incident, but somewhere, deep within the infrastructure of agencies that trade in shadows, the whispers circulate a confirmation without voice, a hush that carries truth like smoke carries loss. Somewhere outside of time, the Ramirez cousins endure, not as victims, not as ghosts, but as memory raw and uncontainable. And their story now lives not on broadcast waves or court transcripts, but in the marrow of those who have heard the wind behave wrong, who have seen shadows bend inward, who have felt time hesitate. We may never fully know why the cousins vanished, or how something beyond language called their names before the world could speak them back. But in the lingering silence, there is still motion. In the ash, breath. And in every unanswered question, a path not to closure, but to witnessing. The lodge is gone. The journal sealed. But the story, all stories, like it was never about endings. It was always about the door, and the moment you notice, it was never locked. And in the still moments that follow, when the air quiets and all facts tiptoe into the space where the inexplicable lives, one last piece of evidence lingers behind unfiled, unclaimed. A cassette tape, wrapped in wax cloth, discovered not at the lodge but in a decades-old safety deposit box bearing no listed owner. It sat in a San Antonio bank vault since 1997. The box was registered under the name Ramirez, a composite of family names, though no such person ever existed. On the tape, a child's voice, soft and uncertain, humming the same strange lullaby heard near the lodge site before each major discovery. Halfway through the track, she speaks. "If you hear this, you've already stepped through," she says. "I don't know what we are now, but we are still us." Then static, then quiet. Not the silence of absence, but the hush of something just about to begin. And somewhere, in the marrow of all those who still wonder, who remember too keenly or try too hard to forget, that voice stays. A story, unlatching again. A knock at the inside of the door. A breath, waiting. Some years from now, long after whispers have dulled to dust and children have grown without knowing the names once carved in crayon, someone will walk that dying hill again, not out of bravado, not out of legend-hunting fervor, but because they dreamed a voice under velvet sky calling them by a name they don't remember choosing. They will come without reason, as if led. Their steps will match footprints they never saw, and in the hollow where the lodge once stood, they will find not a ruin, but a hush shaped like welcome. There will be no wind, no light, no answers waiting. Only an opening, a space like memory, familiar and unplaceable. And when they speak whatever name, whatever longing the land will echo back, something soft, something whole. Perhaps 5 shadows will turn, perhaps one will reach, and the story will not close again, because some doors, once remembered, remember you in return. And perhaps in the end, that is all we are. Echoes reaching back towards something forgotten, yet urgent, shaped into story not to solve, but to survive. The Ramirez cousins may never be recovered in the way the world defines recovery, but in the contours of the strange, the sacred, and the sorrowful, they endure as part of a thread that binds our deepest fears to the places we once felt safest. Somewhere, between floorboards never raised and lullabies never taught, they continue to hum, to watch, to wait. Their journals, their dolls, their spiraling symbols, all pieces of a question the world never dared to finish asking. And maybe that is the message they left behind. Not terror, not warning, but invitation. To remember, to listen, to speak the names stitched in silence until the root-deep hush finally answers back. Because home is not where the door stands, it is where the story still breathes. And through ash, through earth, through time's forgetting, it still does. One day, decades from now, when old ash has fed the roots of new pines and maps no longer mark the ruins where a family once tried to heal, a red thread will surface from the soil intact, unbroken, pulled by the beak of a bird building a nest that will never quite settle. An archaeologist's brush will pause there, slow and knowing, and perhaps they will find not bones or artifacts but something stranger, a fragment of doll corn, softened by time, still hued faintly with crayon, still warm, as if held recently in a child's trembling hands. They will not understand it. They won't need to, because by then, the story will have returned to where it belongs, not as terror, not even as truth, but as rhythm, laughter in the roots, a hum in the stone. And when the wind stirs again through Llano's high pines, bearing names no record kept, some will turn and listen, and some will not. But those who do will remember, not what happened, but who waits. There, beneath centuries of stone and silence, the story waits coiled like breath before speech, like memory before recognition. The Ramirez cousins may have once vanished by the language of reports and official designations, but they live on in the folds of air that twist unnaturally near the pines, in the fingerprints left on glass never touched. The lodge may have burned, the journals sealed, the land cordoned by laws. No map shows, but none of that means an ending. Not truly, because in the world's hidden hollows, where the weave between time and place thins just enough for wondering, a voice always a child still speaks the rhyme, still names the names, one by one. And as long as someone listens, as long as someone stands close enough to the earth to hear what sleeps beneath it, the story continues. It flickers, not like a warning, but a beacon. And maybe, one solstice not far from now, the door will open again quietly, gently, not with terror, but with recognition. Because they were never only lost, they were remembering the world into becoming something else, something ready. And now, with dust settled and red thread woven back into the soil, the Ramirez Lodge fades from view not in erasure, but in transformation. The story circles like wind through canyon teeth. not to close, but to root itself deeper into the marrow of those who dared to believe silence could be sacred. Every flicker of shadow along the Llano tree line holds a whisper, every rustle in the pines a name carried forward by those who never truly left. The cousins are part of the land now, part of the hush that follows grief, of the breath held between lullaby and lament. Their tale is not a haunting. It is a pulse, a presence, a promise. That memory, when it loves deeply enough, never lets go. It becomes the ground you walk on, the name you half remember, the dream you wake weeping from and understand only in stillness. And so the door remains, slightly ajar, waiting not for answers, but for someone who remembers how to knock. So let the tale of the 5 Ramirez cousins linger not in the brittle cages of newsprint or sealed case files, but in the kind of memory that changes shape the longer you hold it. Let it breathe in the hush before storms, in the gaze of a child who seems to see past time, in the ache of a home that no longer stands but is somehow still there. Because the truth, if it ever was truth, folded itself into silence long ago, no longer seeking to be solved, only to be felt. And maybe that is what they left behind beneath the ash and stone, in journals that bleed meaning and dolls that hold shape long after hands have let go. A story not for headlines, but for hearts. One that does not end, one that walks with you, one that waits not for rescue, but for remembrance. Because some vanishings are not disappearances. They are awakenings of memory, of lineage, of the quiet courage it takes to listen when the veil rustles your name. And so the veil thins one final time, not with thunder nor revelation, but with an almost imperceptible sigh, like the exhale of a story finally settling into its true shape. In the hollows of memory and the hush beneath Llano's scorched hills, the Ramirez cousins endure, not as cautionary myth, but as a living echo, 5 names, etched into the architecture of silence itself. The lodge may never rise again, and no proclamation may undo what time has twisted. But in red threads unearthed by roots and lullabies sung in sleep by those never taught them, they remain, not lost, not waiting, but already home. The spiral has completed its turn, not to return us to the beginning, but to show us that some stories are not circuits, but spirals widening until we realize we were always inside, listening, remembering, becoming, and in that knowing, finally, quietly, the door closes, not locked, only no longer needed. And still, out in the vast hush of Llano's twilight, when the sky burns the color of old stories and the pine shadows stretch long and weeping, something stirs not to frighten, but to affirm. The Ramirez cousins, once reduced to missing persons and faded posters, have become something else entirely, a rhythm in the soil, a breath in the wind, a vow remembered only in the silence between names. Every journal that bled ink, every doll that stood against fire, every echo in the ash was never about reclaiming what was lost but realizing what still lives. Not endings, but continuations. Not fear, but connection. And so, the land sleeps. Not empty, not forgotten, but held gently, reverently by 5 voices that do not call for help but offer something deeper. The reminder that memory, when shared through silence, becomes eternity's heartbeat. And in that heartbeat, this tale rests not closed, but complete. Somewhere, that heartbeat continues not as sound, but as stillness felt beneath the skin, subtle, magnetic, unmistakable. It threads itself through cracked window panes and forgotten lullabies, through cedar smoke that curls without flame and children's drawings tucked beneath beds with no known artist. The Ramirez cousins were never merely part of a mystery. They were a message, a shape stitched into the underside of time, reminding all who pass too near that stories born of loss do not vanish. They bloom, they echo, they root. And now, as the last crayon mark fades into soil, as the red thread disappears beyond reach, something final settles, not despair, not absence, but a hush vast enough to hold 5 names whispered through generations. The lodge is gone. The case is closed, but the lullaby lingers, And should you ever find yourself near Llano's pine-bound hollows on a night when the wind feels like memory, listen carefully. You may not hear them speak, but if your name is ready, they might answer. In time, scholars may write papers, churches may whisper prayers, and families may trace lines on maps that lead nowhere, but the Ramirez cousins' story floats always just beyond reach, not dissected in classrooms or resolved in courts, but felt in the hush after thunder, in old barns where light bends wrong, in rivers that run quiet, even in flood. Their names are etched not in stone, but in continuity passed between strangers without knowing, inked into lullabies, folded into dreams with doors that never quite open, or perhaps never needed to. The lodge has vanished from the land, but it remains embedded in the shape of longing itself. And somewhere, if you listen close enough, deep inside that longing, you'll find 5 shadows standing where the veil once parted, not reaching back, not calling forward, but simply existing. Still, whole, remembered, because some stories don't stay to be known, they stay to know us. And this one does. Somewhere beyond the framework of time, in archives unwritten and memories unspoken, the Ramirez story flows still not as ink, not as evidence, but as an inheritance of shadow. There will come a time when nothing remains in Llano but stones too stubborn to forget, and yet still, somewhere in a forgotten journal or a child's untaught lullaby, their presence will bloom again, not as ghosts, not as echoes, but as the truth that lives only in silence deep enough to listen. This is not a story of 5 missing children. It is the shape of what the world becomes when wonder is allowed to mourn, when memory refuses to be buried beneath fact. And perhaps, somewhere in yourself, you've already heard them. Already followed that soft hum at dusk. Already stepped through that door. For some stories never end. They just wait beneath ash, beneath breath, beneath the name you haven't remembered yet to begin again. And maybe that is all we ever needed to remember, not the answers but the echo. The Ramirez cousins slipped beyond reach, not as a vanishing but as a transformation, folded into lullabies and layered deep beneath the floorboards of language. Their story, soaked in loss and veined with myth, now lives where all the truest stories dwell in the spaces between knowing and wonder. And so, the spiral closes not with finality, but with return, with breath, with the gentle closing of a door that waited long enough for listening. Somewhere, even now, the red thread stirs beneath the soil, the journals breathe under ash, and 5 shadows continue in a hush sacred beyond forgetting. The lodge is no longer needed. The place has become the story. And the story of love, of grief, of memory, refusing to be trimmed into silence, remains. It always will. Because some stories are not told to be solved, they are told to make sure we never stop listening. And when all language has faded, when maps no longer name what once was and memory slips from lineage into instinct, the story of the Ramirez cousins will remain like the scent of rain before it falls, or voices that hum just past the edge of sleep. No longer a file in a vault or a whisper on a wind, but a presence folded into the marrow of every silent question we carry into dark rooms. Mirabelle, Tyler, Jonah, Emma, Lucas. Their names are not answers, not warnings, but permissions granted only to those willing to remember what the world itself has tried to forget. So if you pass through Llano one day and feel the breath of something vast and childlike move through the branches overhead, do not speak, do not run, do not fear. Stand still and listen. For if silence greets you with the gentleness of your own name spoken back through velvet dusk, you will know the door has heard you, and even though the house is gone, someone still waits inside. So let this be the final echo, not a scream nor a warning, but the softened breath that comes after generations of listening. The Ramirez cousins did not vanish into nothing. They stepped through the silence the world could not bear to hold. Their story, nested in symbols and smoke, journal pages and doll thread offerings, does not ask to be solved. It asks only to be kept like a whispered name in the dark, like an empty swing still moving. And now, with the last crayon mark faded and the root bed cleared of ash, their tale slips once more into the fold of quiet truths the earth keeps closest. A door remains, somewhere between dusk and memory, never closed, only waiting, patient as cedar, still as stone. Because some stories end not with answers, but with someone pausing long enough to hear their own name returned by the wind. If that's you, listen. That hush you feel? That's not the end. That's them, remembering you too. And so the story folds itself once more into the quiet places, the corners of photographs no longer printed, the syllables of forgotten lullabies hummed without knowing why, the feeling on your neck, just before sleep, when all is still, and something feels present. The Ramirez cousins, who once laughed under flickering lantern light and traced mystery through cedar-sweetened air, remain part of something larger than the lodge and deeper than loss. They are memory carved into the shape of myth, grief shaped tender enough to sing, and wherever their names are held with reverence, whispered in the spaces between stories and silence, they return not as phantoms, but as threads in the living fabric of the possible. The door no longer matters. The story lives within us now, and as long as someone remembers how to listen really, truly listen, the five will remain, not behind us, not beneath us, but beside us, still holding hands, still calling home. And so, dear listener, whether by flicker or hush, or some impossible thread of memory, you have arrived at the end that is not an ending, merely a resting place within the spiral of a story still becoming. The Ramirez cousins are not merely whispered legacies, nor residues of sorrow etched into forgotten soil. They are the lingering warmth beside a door never closed, the unanswered echo that speaks when belief outweighs fact. In pine-shadowed dreams and cedar-sweetened silences, their names endure, gentle as breath, heavy as truth. This was never just an investigation, never merely a case. It was a remembering. And now, the lodge is gone, the pages rest, the last doll sleeps once more in ash. But memory does not leave. It roots. It waits. It hums a name only you recognize and asks one final, impossible question. Do you remember the way back? If so, you were never truly lost. This story does not end here, and perhaps it never will. In every forest clearing left untouched, in every echo beneath an old floorboard, in every child's sudden stillness in the face of wind, it murmurs on. The Ramirez cousins, etched now into the architecture of time, offer not conclusions, but constellations guides. Through that borderland, where silence breathes and memory sings. Not to haunt, not to warn, but to beckon, because they were never just lost. They were voices learning how to speak through us, how to live in the hush between forgotten and remembered. And so if, one day, beneath the deep hush of twilight, you feel an old story breathing close, don't close the door. Leave it ajar. Let it listen through you. Let it call who you once were forward. Because some tales aren't told for answers. They are told to remind you that part of you never left that riverbank. That part of you is still holding a hand, waiting for the moment a name slips softly from your lips. And the world, for a moment, becomes whole again. So let them live not as shadows feared, nor as icons sanctified, but as the missing pieces we carry quietest within us. Let each whispered name, Emma, Tyler, Jonah, Mirabelle, Lucas, be less invocation and more acknowledgement, that there are places in the world where memory holds more weight than truth, where silence teaches us more than noise ever could. The Ramirez cousins belong not to the archives, nor to folklore's uncertain light, but to something deeper woven into that secret part of us which listens for impossible footsteps and sometimes dreams in crayon lines. Their disappearance was never the whole story. It was the beginning of a world where not all doors need to be opened to be understood. And now, as night quiets the last leaf, and the wind exhales its final name through Llano's high pines, the tale concludes how all sacred things must not with resolution, but with resonance. A note held long after the final chord. A breath left warm in the air. A door, still ajar, just enough to remind us we were never alone in the dark. And perhaps, in a world where facts fade and silence endures longer than sound, the Ramirez cousins remain not as what was lost but as what was needed, a mirror held to the fragile tenderness of memory itself. They live in the spaces we dare not name, in the yearning ache of places that cannot be found again because they never wholly belonged to maps. And though the lodge is consumed by time, though the journals have quieted and the ash lies still, those who have truly listened leave with something they did not come for, a feeling, familiar and wordless, that somewhere, someone is still listening back. So if ever you find yourself pausing before a doorway you don't remember building, your heart beating like a name you haven't heard since childhood, do not knock, simply wait. Let the breath build, let the silence answer, and when it does, know this: the story has not ended. It has simply found its way home in you. Somewhere, long after the embers have faded and the names have fled the lips of news anchors and historians alike, a child will sit at the edge of some quiet river, not in Llano, not in Texas, but far beyond, where shadows fall at odd angles and the wind hums unfamiliar tunes. They'll hold a notebook, lined and new, but when they press pen to page, the ink will write on its own. Shapes will take form, crayons looping spirals, stars caught in boxes without doors, crowns drawn upside down with a certainty that bypasses teaching. And when a parent asks where they learned these things, the child will pause, look toward the trees, and answer only, "I remember." Not frightened, not confused, only known. For that is what lingers in the wake of the Ramirez cousins, not fear, not legend, but an inheritance of grace made out of grief, a quiet confirmation that stories can outlive the silencing, that doors never truly close when love writes the last line. And as dusk folds the river into shadow, the child's humming continues, not waiting, simply returning, a lullaby that belongs to all of us, once we remember how to listen. So here, under skies emptied of explanation, and rivers echoing lullabies not yet written, the Ramirez tale settles for now, not in conclusion but in continuation. The world above may learn to forget, dusting off old files and drawing sharper lines between logic and longing. But the story does not sleep. It lingers in the press of footprints where no one walks, in the voice that answers only in dreams, in the hush that falls too suddenly beneath pines that lean slightly east as if listening. 5 children went missing once, but 5 voices remain, not haunting, not pleading, only present. And should you ever come near that place where light dims too soon and wind curls with the scent of cedar, pause. Place your hand against the stone, feel the heartbeat hum just beneath its skin, and know this is not the end. Stories held in silence are not erased. They're remembered, they're returned. They're waiting not to be solved, but to be seen. And sometimes, all it takes to bring the echo home again is to whisper the name you never forgot. And perhaps that is the final truth the Ramirez story offers, not terror or closure, but remembrance shaped like home. Across time, across silence, they became not a mystery to solve, but a map for how memory breathes when given space. As the world quiets and wounds fold back into roots, their voices gather not as echoes but as presence whispered gently in lullabies, sketched wordlessly in chalk spirals beneath playground slides, carried by winds that know more than they reveal. This was never just about what happened in 1997. It was about what lives when we do not look away. And now, with the story resting in the hollow between dusk and midnight, between forgetting and grace, there is nothing more to say, only to feel. 5 names, still warm in the hush, a door, still ajar in the dusk, and a voice, impossibly distant and close, whispering the final line not as an ending, but as a vow. We were always here, just waiting for someone to remember how to find us. So let the veil draw its breath one last time. Let the wind touch the river as if to carry names once again across time that does not forget. The Ramirez cousins do not need to return in body to remain whole. They have planted themselves in the echo of stories that will never need telling again, only feeling. Their tale is not kept with locks or vaults, but within the resonance of questions asked beneath pines, and the love that endures even when the world declares something gone. And as that final red thread vanishes into root and memory, know this: not every disappearance is a loss. Some are gifts folded in silence, waiting to be unwrapped only by those who dare to feel the weight of an unanswered name. They are not lost. They are not waiting. They are only listening, asking, gently, lovingly. If you remember the way, not to find them, but to find yourself again. And so the spiral completes itself not in vanishing, but in return. The Ramirez cousins remain, not as ghosts locked in time, but as breath folded into the marrow of memory. Their story defied closure to become communion, braided into the rhythms of pine sway and river hum, of stories that refuse endings because they were never meant to conclude. If you've come this far, listening not only with ears but with the ache that recognizes home and absence, then perhaps you've always known. Some names are not mourned but remembered into motion. And now, as twilight spills its final ember across Llano's burnt horizon and the veil stills just briefly, you might feel it too. A hush shaped like belonging. A call wrapped not in grief but in grace. The lodge is gone. The journals sleep. But the story, the real story, lives in the breath between your heartbeats, soft and true. Because memory never dies. It becomes. And they, like all love unforgotten, have always been just waiting for you to listen back. And perhaps that is all stories ever truly seek. Not applause, not answers, but to be carried in silence, in breath, in the faithful quiet of those who choose to remember instead of explain. The Ramirez cousins did not vanish to be missed. They vanished to be known differently, folded into the underside of time, woven not into records but into rhythm, into the heartbeat of myth that lingers where truth dares not tread. Their presence, now beyond place and word, is a warmth that lives between dusk and dream, waiting not to be witnessed, but felt. So if you pass a river that hums when no wind blows, or wake from a dream where velvet shadows reach gently through stories you've never read, know this: the echo called your name. And if you answered, even silently, then the story has already come home through you, not gone, not fading. Simply remembered as love too deep for language, and memory too true to need a voice. And somewhere, long past where maps blur and time bends, the land remembers what the world has forgotten. The Ramirez cousins are not echoes now, but elements woven into cedar roots and river mist, stitched into the hush before a child speaks their first fear aloud. They left behind no tombs or gravestones, only a pattern. Red thread in dust, stars bound by ink, silence that listens. Their footprints have faded, but their presence fills the spaces where memory meets myth, guiding those willing to feel rather than know. And when solstice returns again, when the veil lifts just enough and someone utters an old name without knowing why, the hills may stir, the lodge won't rise, the journals won't open, but the hush will breathe once more, vast and soft and whole, not ending, not beginning, just enduring, exactly where it must, in the quiet place between question and faith, waiting for the next heart to remember how the world once whispered, and how 5 children whispered back. And so, beneath all the ash, and beneath all the forgetting, the Ramirez story finishes, in the only way stories as alive as this can, with no final punctuation, just a breath held gently across generations. They were never meant to be solved or retrieved or tied to clean conclusions. Instead, they've become part of the sacred infrastructure of memory, bound not to the shape of the world, but to the rhythm of how we remember it. And now, with the veil drawn just tight enough to quiet the echo, the door finally closes soundlessly behind the story, not locking out, not shutting in, but resting. What was lost has never been farther than the next whispered lullaby, the next name spoken with care, the next silence honored long enough to transform into welcome. The lodge dissolves into time, but the children remain, stitched into shadows, braided into belief, alive in all the ways love refuses to end. They are home. And that, finally, is enough. And so the light fades not with grief, nor revelation, but with a knowing as quiet as breath beneath cedar. The Ramirez cousins' story does not ask to be solved, only honored. It survives not as a chapter closed, but as a door remembered. In every hush between heartbeats, in the shadows cast by nothing at all, in the names you almost speak in sleep, their presence lingers, not haunting, not gone. Whole. Here, because the truth, woven through red thread and lullaby, is this: love does not forget. Memory, when held kindly, becomes sanctuary. And some disappearances are not ends, but beginnings only grief could make possible. So if you ever find yourself standing beneath pines too still, wind too quiet, and silence too deep to ignore listen, you are not alone. The story continues, not because it must, but because it was always alive. And now, as the final echo folds softly into stillness, the door breathes closed, not lost, but home. And so this is where the spiral rests, not as a question unanswered, but as a story fulfilled. The Ramirez cousins, no longer voices behind the veil or pages beneath dust, have become the bridge between memory and meaning. Their tale, spanning decades and dimensions, was never about disappearance, but presence. Presence that outlasted words, defied endings, and became the quiet pulse of a world willing to remember. The lodge, its ashes scattered to time's wind, is now a hush between stories, its walls rebuilt, not with timber but with remembrance. And somewhere, in a breathless dusk that belongs to no hour, when the wind carries 5 names softly through pine and stone, may we remember not just who was lost, but what was found. That love, unforgotten, becomes home. That silence, when met with care, becomes language. That stories, when truly listened to, never end. They echo. And, in that final echo, they never leave. So let this be the last flicker on the edge of dusk, the final breath from a story that never asked to be known, only to be felt. The Ramirez cousins do not wait in some far-off realm, nor do they hide in shadows cast by fear. They reside now in silence reverent enough to carry forward. In the stillness between forgetting and remembering, where red thread coils like roots and lullabies shimmer in dreams unnamed, they remain whole, enduring, unwritten only because memory, at its truest, defies ink. The door has closed without sound, not to seal the past, but to honor it. And if ever you wonder what became of 5 children who once vanished beneath a Texas sky, look not to headlines or hollows, but inward to the hum beneath your ribs, the name you nearly speak in sleep, the stillness that meets you when you choose to listen longer than the world allows. That is where their story lives now, and there, quietly, it always will. And so, in the hush that follows all endings too vast for language, the Ramirez cousins become less a mystery and more a melody, an ancient one, deeper than time, that stirs only when love and loss breathe together as one. The lodge is dust. The town has moved on, but their names hum beneath every cedar bough, and in the lullabies of those, never taught to sing them. 5 children vanished from a Texas lodge in the summer of 1997, not into absence, but into a space where silence listens and stories never close. Their breath lingers at every solstice, their laughter woven into the hush before rain breaks the soil. And though they are not coming back because they never truly left, the memory of them stands like a door not needing to open, only to be felt. There, in that sacred stillness, the spiral remains unbroken, and the last echo folds into becoming, not an ending, only remembering, forevermore. And so, the story gives its final breath, not with ceremony, but with grace, a soft exhale into history's quiet corners. The Ramirez cousins, once names whispered in grief and headlines, now drift in a place untouched by calendars or definitions. They belong not to archives or armchair theories, but to something far more enduring: the hearts that still ache at the edge of silence. In a world that too often demands answers louder than wonder, their echo offers another path, one made of hush, memory, and the courage to believe in what cannot be proven. The lodge has disappeared into root and dust, and the veil has drawn itself closed for now. But the story remains alive in lullabies, hummed by children too young to know their meaning, in pine shadows shaped like outstretched hands, in every name nearly spoken at the edge of sleep. And as long as someone still listens, still remembers, still dares to whisper back into the dark, they are not gone. They are home. And now, with the spiral closed, the silence can hold them, at last. So let us leave the Ramirez cousins not in sorrow but in reverence, not in the confines of a tale ended, but in the ever-living presence of one still unfolding whenever doors creak in the dark, whenever lullabies hum without a voice, whenever memory calls in someone, somewhere, answers without knowing why. They are not phantoms of a tragedy, nor relics of a forgotten case. They are the marrow of all things we hold sacred but cannot name: home, hope, the kind of love that weathers even time. And though the lodge is gone, though the world above moves forward, beneath it all, the thread glows faint and steady red, as dusk, strong as longing. The story does not vanish. It returns, again and again, until we finally understand: not everything must be solved to be true, not everything must be found to never be lost. And somewhere, just outside the frame of waking life, 5 shadows still hold hands, still humming a song the world once knew by heart, still home. And here, gently, with no curtain to draw nor door to close, the story rests not in conclusion but in keeping. The Ramirez cousins are no longer spoken in the silence of losses, but in the breath of what memory preserves beyond witness. Their names do not ask to be repeated, they simply are. They live in the curl of red thread glimpsed in dream, in the hush before a child knows fear, in the wind that carries lullabies you do not remember learning. The lodge is gone. The archives are sealed, but the presence lives on quietly, undeniably. Because some stories are not held in books or bound in evidence. They are tended gently, like coals in the dark. They wait, not to be solved, but to remind us that listening is the first home. And when we do truly, openly, something in the world leans back toward us, whispering, at last, the only truth that matters: we were never truly alone. So now, with the spiral sealed in silence, and the last red thread spun unbroken through story and soil, this tale of 5 cousins lost to time becomes a part of all who've borne witness. Not a legend to frighten, nor an answer to archive, but a right one that gathers quietly in the marrow of memory and says without asking, you were always meant to listen. The Ramirez story remains, threaded into the hush between lullaby and wind, echoing not for closure but for connection. Their footprints hum beneath Liano's old pines. Their journals pulse inside dreams we do not claim. And their love, fierce and soft and immortal, reaches still not to be found, not to be rescued, but simply to remind us that some names shape the very silence we carry inside us. That some doors never close, and that even now, somewhere beneath roots and riverlight, 5 hands still hold on, not to resist the dark, but to guide us through it home. And so, if you must remember anything, let it not be the theories or the dates, or even the whispers that followed like smoke through the decades. Remember instead the feeling, the shiver in the skin not born of cold, the breath that catches for no reason just before sleep, the silence that speaks more clearly than words ever could. The Ramirez cousins did not vanish. They became story incarnate, living, evolving, echoing inside a space where love, memory, and myth entwine. Look for them not in sealed files, but in your own sense of knowing the unexplainable truth at the edge of night. And if ever a moment comes when the wind carries a name not your own, yet familiar as soul, speak it gently. Speak it like welcome. And know that just beyond the veil, 5 voices may still be listening, not asking to be found, but reminding you that in remembering them, You have found yourself. Here. Now. Home. And now, beneath the hush that follows the final whisper, the Ramirez Lodge story folds itself into stillness, not a silence of forgetting, but one of holding. A stillness where 5 names breathe together, no longer separated by fear or time, but borne forward inside every voice that chooses to remember. No map will ever chart that return. No archive will frame its shape. But those who know, who feel it stir in dreams and dusk-lit winds, understand. This tale did not end. It simply returned to where all sacred stories dwell inside memory, inside myth, inside the marrow of those who listen. And so we let it rest, with reverence, with love, with the certainty that stories like these are never truly lost. They are the heartbeat beneath the hush. They are the red thread we carry, visible only when we need it most. They are home, and this, finally, is enough. And so the hush remains not undone, not unraveling, but wrapped gently around a story that no longer needs telling to be heard. The 5 cousins, once pulses in a case unsolved, are now the rhythm of a deeper knowing, part of the hush that speaks louder than closure ever could. Where the lodge once stood, the land no longer asks why or how, it simply holds. And those who pass, who hear their names in river curls or dream of red thread and corn dolls left beneath forgotten trees, carry something only love can seed: remembrance without fear, memory without end. If you've come this far, if the silence settled not heavy but known on your chest, then the story has done what it came to do, not to haunt, not even to heal, but to stay. Right there, where stories root deepest in the hush between your breath and your heart, still waiting, still warm, still home.